Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss an open letter written by the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, known by its abbreviation CCIF. It's been officially, in some ways, designated a quote-unquote enemy of the French Republic. Now, since the French government has also announced that it wants to dissolve the CCIF, the organization has been hit by a barrage of insults as well as threats from the far right on social networks, and there hasn't really been seemingly an intervention on the part of the state to stand up and protect this organization. There are even political figures in France who have pinned what happened vis-a-vis the teacher's beheading and possibly even what happened today. Just as we're coming to air, we know about that attack that has happened in Nice in France as well. They're trying to pin that, or possibly trying to pin that, I should say, I shouldn't overstate that, on organizations who have denounced Islamophobia and therefore also then the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, etc. Also, now the CCIF has filed a formal complaint with the UN Human Rights Council saying that it is genuinely fearful now for its own team members and whether or not they'll be able to operate within this increasingly Islamophobic, quote-unquote, atmosphere there in France. So we're going to discuss that and, of course, all the other related issues to this very significant crisis right now within France on this issue. We're joined now by Dr. Nasira Grenef, who is a sociologist and anthropologist. She's also a professor at Paris University 8, which is the University of Paris 8. She is joining us now from the French capital, Paris. Also joining us from Paris is Abdenour Toumi, who is an expert at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, or ORSAM, which is based in Turkey. Abdenour and Nasira, thank you both for your time today and for joining us here in Scope. And Nasira, I'd like to start with you. Just on this issue of this, this organization, the CCIF, and the open letter that's put out there, do you think that there is less and less room for us to be able to separate attacks that do occur as well as then Islamophobia?
I think that their letter clearly states that it's more and more difficult to make the difference between Muslims who are completely entrenched and participating in the French society and those that are claiming some sense of Islam that leads them to extreme and horrific gestures and attacks. And when it comes to CCIF, which I've known since its inception in 2003 and even before, they have always been under attack. They have always been struggling to make the point about Islamophobia, about being a major issue for the whole French society, not just for Muslims in France. And they have always faced this kind of double discourse, accusation that and all kind of suspicious stances against them. Never anyone acknowledged the work and the job that they've been doing in defending and supporting people who are facing Islamophobia. And we are facing now the end of the moment when, maybe because they were effective in fighting Islamophobia and bringing it to the French agenda, especially last year, maybe because of that, there's this attack now on them, on their organization, and maybe they are paying the effectiveness that they've shown in the past years.
Abdenour, thoughts on that, right? Because, again, when we're talking about Islamophobia within France, it seems that space is becoming more and more limited, right? And that's been occurring for quite a few years now, as Nasira there also alluded to. What are your thoughts on that?
Exactly. I will join definitely Professor Grenef's statement. And chronologically speaking, I mean, this has been worsened the last 5 years, but it's been going on for the last 15, if not 20 years. But at the origin, or basically speaking on this Islamophobia, so in the beginning it started in the late 17, in 18, and the target at that moment was the Arabs, or were the Arabs. I mean, at that moment, the question was clearly about racism, and it was more ethnic elements rather than religious elements. And then it developed quickly. Actually, it's been like 30 years ago with the appearance of the first so-called the Islamic veil in 1989, when these two young little sisters wore the Islamic veil in the junior high school, and that it started at that moment. In those days, the question of the boogeyman was in the hand or kind of selling point of the far-right extremist party of the Front National that just had, changed its name into Rassemblement National, and that at that moment was led by the current chair, Marine Le Pen. At that moment was her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen. So it's very important to know these elements, because this discourse has inflamed the last, as I mentioned earlier, the last 5 years, a kind of a banalization in the media and in the French political spectrum, especially the right. So now, and what is very interesting here, what President Macron did in 2017 when he came to power, he imploded all the conventional political parties. It started with the Socialist Party and then even the right. So then the French media, and led by some controversial writers, his name is Eric Zemmour, who was kind of the darling boy of the Marine land. I'm sorry to play with this game word, but that's how it developed until President Macron got trapped into this discourse. Right. And all we know recently, President Macron is facing very tough challenges in his
Indeed. I'm glad you brought that up, Noor, because I wanted to, in fact, ask you about that, Nasira, as well. A lot of people, of course, have put the context of the fact that we have right now, at least within the polls, a lot of support for Marine Le Pen as well, and as well as her, more far-right ideology, and seemingly more and more French are going that way. And it seems that Macron is trying to, is essentially fighting for his political life and trying to see that, that he can still do well in the upcoming elections. Does that explain then what is happening completely? I mean, is this essentially Macron who has been put into a corner politically, and that's why then he is in many ways arguably scapegoating Muslims?
Yes, maybe it's important for your viewers to remember that we are in the middle of a pandemic that was very badly held in France, and we are starting a new lockdown tonight, very specifically. And I think that one of the shifts that we have witnessed for the past weeks that has twofold is Macron presenting himself as protecting the French people. So on the one hand, he would become this president that is very thoughtful and careful about saving the healthcare and the economy of the French society, and therefore working towards the benefit of French population. And the other fold of this, there are two folds, is that he's protecting the French people from the threat of Islamic radicalization, Islamic politicized violence, extremist violence. There has been a whole statement on his part early October before this unfortunate and horrendous beheading of our colleague, the professor in Conflans-Sainte-Honorine. And one of the major statements that he did, that Macron did during this political shift, was to say that France was fighting against separatist Muslims in France, and he targeted very specifically Muslims. It was not about any kind of other separatists, not white supremacists, not white nationalists. It was Muslims that were targeted. It was the Arabic language that was targeted. So obviously there is something there going on about trying to cast himself as someone who is a savior for the French population, for the French society, for the French prestige of France and what it fights for. And as you know, one of the stances is that he's fighting in favor of freedom of expression. So I think we have to have this in mind. And Macron is one of the latest who is doing this. There has been many politicians before him trying to play on this chord about saving the French population from Muslims.
Abdel Noor, I'll give you the final word then before I let both of you go. On this issue of Muslims and their space within French society. I know that's a very grand and general question, but where does this leave Muslim citizens? Because it's not like Muslims are new in France, right? They've been there for a significantly long period of time, generations upon generations. A, why now? And B, then what happens in the coming days, months, years to these Muslims?
Exactly, that's a good point. Actually, the French people and the French white, when France in general has been dealing with the Muslims, it's not for decades, but for centuries. And this is not new. But it has changed, it has shifted into a kind of, as I mentioned earlier, a boogeyman, because all the politicians now in France have been bankrupt. They have nothing to offer to their voters. However, for instance, like the so-called conventional parties, and President Macron is one of them, now is feeling the heat of the race of the far right, of these xenophobe parties and media, even elite. So then, as Dr. Guinef portrayed it, so he's trying to position himself like, I am the one who's going to play with this. I'm going to take this message from Marine Le Pen. However, what he's missing, so I think President Macron now is haunted by a one-term president, like his predecessor Sarkozy and Hollande. So now he knew, it's too late, and he knew he failed. So in terms of managing the health crisis, the COVID-19, and also now he's going to deal with another security issue. So now he's going to be, I think he will continue hammering and this narrative for his narrative in terms of that will lead him to the election on 2022. Yeah. But this is actually very interesting with the latest development of this morning. I think in the light of this horrible violence, I think he will go on to raise the tone, and that will impact his policy domestically and regionally and internationally.
All right, we'll leave that as the final word, but we do sincerely appreciate both Abdel Noor and Nasira for their time today, for speaking to us, even though I know they both have very busy schedules. It's important to discuss this stuff in a calm fashion, right? Because what's happening in France, again, it's not completely new. It's been happening slowly, as Nasira and Abdel Noor had laid out for us, for many years now. What we're seeing now is seemingly a more right-wing culmination of all this, because it also politically makes sense to do so for the French government. I'm speaking about specifically Emmanuel Macron here, because he is, if we're completely honest, fighting for his political career right now in the face of a threat of Marine Le Pen winning over him in these upcoming elections there in France. Why is her support going up? Why is French society moving ever more right-wing? That's the question that we all have about right-wing movements across the world, right? So it's not like France is unique in that regard. It's happening across European countries and across many countries in the Western world as well. It's because we all know that hate sells. right? So it's always easy to scapegoat somebody and then ride on that wave of hate into office. Hate is seemingly also a money-making business as well, as we've, many, many times spoken about here on Scope as well, be it about Islamophobia or other forms of hatred. So this is certainly a threat not just to Muslims in France, but to all minorities in France, because once you have hatred towards one group of people, it's very easy to translate that then to other groups of people. So this remains a threat not just to Muslims, but to others as well. Of course, none of this means or that this is a justification for any attacks on any innocents at any given point in time. Nevertheless, though, that does not justify also hatred towards an entire group of Muslims or otherwise. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss a statement of Robert O'Brien, who is U.S. President Donald Trump's national security advisor. He recently said, and this had been tweeted just, I believe, a day or two ago by Mohammad Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, in which he said that the U.S. has imposed so many sanctions on Iran and Russia that, quote, that there's very little left for us to do, end quote. In a sense, as Javad Zarif said, has the U.S. out-sanctioned itself? Is it even possible to do so? And we're going to discuss that now with our esteemed panelists who are joining us today. We're joined by Dr. Kamran Gasanov, who is a senior fellow at the People's Friendship University of Russia. He's joining us today from Moscow. Joining us from Princeton, New Jersey this morning is Dr. Hushang Anir-Ahmadi, who is a distinguished professor at Rutgers University. Hushang and Kamran, thank you both for your time today. Hushang, let me start with you. What do you make of O'Brien's statement? In a sense, do you think that these sanctions have sort of run their course?
I think this is the election time, and everything that the U.S. officials say has no value. They basically are saying that we have been very, very tough on Iran. That's what the message is. He's trying to tell the American electorate that the Trump administration has been the toughest. That's number one. And second, he is also somehow right when it comes to economic sanctions. And there is only very few that is left. But sanctions generally are still endless. The U.S., for example, has not yet sanctioned Iranian, airspace, Iranian water space. It could do lots of stuff with the air travel to Iran, to shipping, regarding Iran, and so on. So again, I believe Mr. O'Brien meant to say that they have been very tough on Iran. That's all that he really wanted to say.
Okay. And Kamran, give us the context then of Russia, right? Because we know that, of course, there's been a lot of pressure in that relationship as well, right? Between the U.S. and Russia, and even the EU and Russia. There have been sanctions even by the EU on Russia also, be it about Ukraine or otherwise. Has the U.S. sort of out-sanctioned itself when it comes to Russia as well?
I think directly the sanctions of the United States didn't damage the Russian economy. The main effect is the sanctions of the European Union, and the EU, as we see, they are obliged to confirm and to listen the opinion of the United States. And even if the EU didn't sanction, for example, Nord Stream 2, they still don't like to finalize this project. As for Russia, of course, for Russia, they were very harmful in terms of finances, stability of ruble and prices. And they also led to the closure of the Western technology for our market. But on the other hand, I can say that restrictions at the same time, they stimulate Russian production, especially in agriculture. And now, as you know, Russia has become the largest exporter of wheat in the world and provides not itself with agriculture products, but also Saudi Arabia, Algeria, and other markets.
Hushang, I wonder, and it's argued, as you know, of course, this argument that the sanctions have essentially failed in their goals, right? Where the sanctions were meant to get Iran and obviously Russia as well, I would imagine, to in a sense, bow, or whatever the phrase is. I mean, come around the negotiating table, give up their perceived malign activities, et cetera, et cetera. Have those sanctions worked in that regard? Because I mean, it just seems, at least when I speak to people in Iran, that this is just really hurting the people in Iran more than actually the government.
Well, first, comparing Russia and Iran in the sanctions term is really not appropriate. Russia is a bigger economy, is a European economy, has tremendous connections with Europe. It has normal relations with the United States. They are always in discussions. They have embassies in each other's country. That's a completely different game. I'm surprised that you put Russia and Iran in the same category vis-a-vis US. Iran, on the other hand, is 42 years has been in inimical relation with the U.S. There is no embassy. There is no relation whatsoever. The sanction goes back for 40-some years. I mean, this is a completely, Iran is a smaller economy, and this is a theocracy in Iran that has mismanaged the country significantly, tremendously, and that even the Islamic Republic itself says that sanctions are only 20% of its problems, that 80% is mismanagement by the ruling mullahs. So I think this is a completely different thing. In terms of the sanctions reaching its goal, I think it has. In a way, the sanctions purpose was to cripple the Iranian people and the economy. Sanctions have never crippled the regimes. Even the whole world sanctioned Saddam Hussein, and it didn't get anywhere until they prepared the ground for an invasion. So what sanctions does, it delegitimizes the regime, makes the people angry at the regime, makes intervention from outside easier. And to that extent, yes, I think it has achieved its goal. I mean, the Iranian rial has, for all practical purposes, is completely collapsed. Yeah. I mean, now we are talking about, 30,000 toman to a dollar. So, I mean, I don't know what the U.S. should do to make people believe that the sanctions have worked. So again, but if you mean sanctions worked in terms of regime change or negotiation, is different. After all, remember, the United States officially doesn't have a regime change policy toward the Islamic Republic. Their policy is pressure towards negotiation. And if Iran has not negotiated, it's bad. It's too bad that Iran doesn't negotiate. I mean, Iran has to really negotiate, and it should not be waiting for more sanctions. It should have negotiated with Trump just day one. So I don't know why they don't. I mean, there is no value in not negotiating, not communicating. I mean, there is no value.
Okay. And I wasn't comparing exactly the Russian and Iranian economies. I think my question may have been misworded in that regard. Certainly the Russian and Iranian cases are very different from each other, but I was referring to the general sanctions policy of the U.S. overall. Kamran, on this topic of the sanctions towards both countries, right? Because again, as I put to Hushang, that the goal was, I imagine, to get them both in line, quote unquote, whatever that may mean, in the U.S.'s eyes. Has that worked with Russia? Because, of course, we know that the Russians don't have as bad a relation with America as do the Iranians, but certainly there are many, many disagreements there.
I think that sanctions in that goal, which the United States wanted to reach, they didn't work. And the goal, I agree with our speaker, that they wanted to make a regime change, as in Iran and in Russia as well. But they led only to the united people. The support of Putin and the Iranian regimes is now stronger than before the sanctions. And as we see at the latest referendum, constitutional referendum in Russia, the support of Putin is very high, and he will rule and rule. And maybe tomorrow we will see the United States president, and after Biden another one, and still we have Putin, we have the regimes of Ayatollah in Iran, and the people support them because these governments can play the card of external enemy and gain the power. As for economy, I think that these sanctions damage the entire world economy, also the United States, because these big powers, yes, I mean the European Union, China and Russia, they see that the United States want to destroy them, and they should react, they should cooperate between each other and to resist these sanctions. And I think that in long-term perspective, if this policy will continue, the European Union will become more independent, will create its own army, and maybe to quit the NATO. And after that, it will be easier to cooperate with Russia and solve all these problems also in Ukraine. And China also maybe will join this alliance, and the United States could be in isolation at the end.
Hushang, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. On that issue that Kamran there just brought up, right, about the external enemy, this sort of hands both governments, right, both the Russians and the Iranians, but we can talk specifically about the Iranians, that external enemy, right, the external enemy. And yes, even though you mentioned that even the Iranians would admit that just a certain percentage of the economy is hurt because of sanctions, nevertheless, this gives the government that sort of ammunition to tell its own people that, listen, we're not doing this to you, it's the outside forces who are doing this to you. Because as you know, of course, with 30,000 tuman, to a dollar, that's made life very, very hard for Iranians. And for a lot of them, not all of them, of course, but for a lot of them, perception again is that this is America that's doing it to them.
Yeah, first, let me say this. I don't know why certain countries have welcomed sanctions as a way of becoming more independent and becoming more, forced into developing their domestic capabilities. And the governments and countries are supposed to do that. They don't have to wait for sanctions to make them happen. That's just a ridiculous way of thinking about this. The countries should not put themselves in a position that they will be sanctioned for right or wrong reason. I think Iran has all kinds of capabilities to develop its economy. It doesn't need to wait for American sanctions to be forced into becoming economically independent. On the other hand, the same thing with Russia. I also have to tell you that to wait for Europe to become independent of the US is just a wishful thinking, at least for the foreseeable future. Europe has proven that it just cannot. After all, Europe has a big stake in relation with the US. European, one day of wine sales for France in the US is equal to the whole thing investment that the French would do in Iran. French will never give up on the U.S. economy and go for Iran if they have to choose. And the same thing with Russia. I think it's a wrong idea to see that the U.S. is gone down the drain, the U.S. is isolated and all that. How can the first economy in the world, let's say the second economy in the world, the first military power in the world will become isolated in the world? How can that happen? That's just not a good way of thinking.
We'll leave there as a final word, but we do sincerely appreciate both Hushang and Kamran for their time today and for sharing their expert opinions with us. That was Kamran speaking to us from Moscow, and Hushang was speaking to us this morning from Princeton, New Jersey. We spoke there about Robert O'Brien essentially saying that, not a lot more can be done. Very little is left for the U.S. to do vis-a-vis sanctioning the Russians and the Iranians. And of course, that was a statement that was also tweeted then by Mohammad Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, saying that the U.S. has quote-unquote, out-sanctioned itself. Has it? I mean, Hushang said that there is still a lot more that can be sanctioned. I mean, we may be speaking here specifically about economic sanctions, but there are a whole bunch of other sanctions that can be placed on Iran. What does this do then for independent policymaking? What does this do for corruption? What does this do for mismanagement? What does this do about, the need for an external enemy to keep a local population in line, if those are all what are the issues in these two respective countries? What does this then do also for the global economy? Is this the way to get the Russians and the Iranians to get in line with the Western policies? Is that even something that should be happening or not? I mean, there's a lot to discuss here, because at the end of the day, in the middle of all of this, as always, are innocent people. We have innocent Iranians as well as innocent Russians in different varying degrees, of course, suffering. So in Iran, we have major shortages of medicines, a dire economic situation for many people. Will this achieve any goal? Will this win hearts and minds for the United States at any level? I'll be back with my final segment after the break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss a poll conducted by YouGov and Arab News that neither two U.S. presidential candidates, that is the incumbent Donald Trump as well as the Democrat presidential candidate Joe Biden, are really that popular or are seen as that good by Middle Eastern and North Africans. So says that recent survey, as I said. Around half of all those questioned in the poll conducted by that poll said that neither of the two candidates would have a great impact, that is, on the Middle East, North Africa region, vis-a-vis positive impact is what I mean, and neither are really that popular either as far as their own personal opinions of those two candidates go as well. What does that mean? I mean, of course, there are many details in this poll as well, breakdown country by country, and certainly every single country has their own respective reasons for either liking or disliking Trump or Biden. For example, the Iraqis do like Trump for being strong on Iran. 57%, I believe, was the figure there. Nevertheless, though, I want to look at this in a more general sense about the Arab world and the Middle East and North Africa region and why they may be not expecting a huge difference in foreign policy, if at all, on the part of these two men. Let's discuss a bit of that further. We're now joined by Shai Franklin, who is a senior fellow at the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute. He's joining us this morning from New York. We're also joined this morning by Dr. Carl Kaltenbailer, who is a professor and director of security studies at the University of Akron. He's joining us today from Copley in Ohio. Carl and Shai, thank you both for your time this morning. Carl, let me start with you. What do you make of this sort of a poll? I mean, is this essentially telling us in some ways that the people in the Middle East and North Africa believe that there won't really be that much of a difference in policy, foreign policy that is, when it comes to Biden and Trump?
Well, in a way, it's not surprising because U.S. policy towards the Middle East hasn't really been that tremendously different, whether it's been a Republican or a Democrat administration. Trump has done some things a bit differently. He's a little bit of an outlier for Republican administration in that he's gone so far towards Israel and in aligning himself with Netanyahu's policies, really kind of giving up on being a neutral arbiter in the Palestinian-Israeli issues. So you see that in the polls. I mean, that's reflected. There's negativity about that. But, I think there's a couple things going on here. One thing is that the Middle East doesn't expect the United States to come and really help them out because it really hasn't in the past. The other thing I think that is really pervasive in particularly Arab countries is this sense of that politicians in general aren't going to help them out. There's a very negative attitude in most of these countries towards their own political class. And so you see that across the board with institutions, politicians within their country. And I don't think they expect it to be any different with foreign politicians.
What are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think that there would be a huge difference if, for example, Biden came into the White House?
I think there would be a huge difference from an American perspective. But for people in the Middle East, particularly in the Arab world, even if you go back a quarter century to the Oslo Accords, there was this sense that now the Palestinians would lead towards statehood and everything would be normalized. In fact, these new agreements with the United Arab Emirates really go back to the Madrid talks, which were before Oslo. But in terms of the impact on the daily lives and on the political situation of Palestinians, the security situation of Palestinians, really nothing has changed. In fact, you can make an argument that they've gone backwards from where they were in 1993. So that's one consideration, I think. Also, I think just a couple of caveats in terms of the poll. 60% of the respondents were from North Africa, and I'm not sure that was weighted in the poll. And also, almost over 2/3 have university degrees. I'm not sure how representative it is of what Americans used to call the Arab street, but these are people, I guess, who are influential. So it is important. I would make another point. When Obama came in after George W. Bush, there was a sense among liberals in the United States and among, I think, many people in the Middle East that the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan, the occupation of the Middle East by the United States would be backtracked. And it didn't really work out that way. In fact, perhaps the Arab Spring was sort of a result of this promise that Obama seemed to bring in. So I think there's a general sense in the Middle East and also among some minority groups in the United States that there's not that much difference between a Republican and a Democrat. That said, the poll does show that there's a significant preference for Biden over Trump.
Yeah.
Just that they don't think that it'll make that much of a difference.
So then what does this say then, Carl, to the United States establishment? I mean, does this or should this say maybe that maybe it's time to stop trying to fix all the problems of the Middle East as it so perceives?
Well, I think this poll underlines that, but that's a pattern of thinking that's going through the establishment, both Republican and Democrat right now, pretty strongly. There's a sense that the United States has really a limited capacity to deal with some of these issues in the Middle East, particularly the governance issues in the Middle East, which are really a product of the domestic politics of these countries. And so the United States does not want to get drawn into these really, really thorny domestic political issues that it really can't solve, and in some ways backfire on the United States, or may backfire on those forces in the country which really could move the country forward. You know, in some of these countries, the United States is viewed as a meddler or as an imperial power. And so a hands-off approach is sometimes not the worst idea. But yeah, I think that having said that the American view will change if we have a change in administration. I think there will be more of an even-handed take on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It'll be interesting to see what happens on Iraq. I know a lot of Iraqis are very concerned that the United States may withdraw or significantly downsize its presence in the country because Biden doesn't have the great overarching concern for Iran the way that Trump does. So there are different things on the minds of Arabs who've answered this poll. You know, Iran, their domestic politics, the Palestinian issue.
Shai, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. Again, going to the same question that I put to Carl, do you think that the establishment should take the message that maybe it is time for less involvement in the Middle East?
I'm not sure that we should condition our involvement in the Middle East or anywhere based on what popular attitudes are in the region. I think if our involvement is constructive and leads to good results, then that will show. It's also important that we prevail on the autocratic governments that we're making peace with, that we're making deals with, that we not just get a deal that's signed on paper and leads to some military agreement, but that it actually translates down to the level of the citizens, which means changing the way they teach in the schools, that they shouldn't demonize the West, they shouldn't demonize Israel. And the more we can do that, the more we can hopefully create a people-to-people connection, so that the work that we're doing, the actions of the United States in the Middle East, are seen in that light rather than just something that's to the favor of the people in power. Even in Israel, Trump's policies in the Middle East seem geared to help Benjamin Netanyahu, not specifically to help Israel, but to help Benjamin Netanyahu. And so I think in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, whatever we do, we need to be doing more to reach out to people and not just to, excuse the expression, dictators.
Very well. We'll leave those off. But we sincerely appreciate both Shai and Carl for their time this morning, speaking to us from New York and Copley, Ohio, respectively, sharing their expertise, of course, on what this poll that's come out of YouGov and Arab News means, essentially showing that even though Biden is more popular than Trump, the two men are not really that popular in the Middle East region. There's not really much expectation on the part of Arabs about what will change, if anything, after November's elections, even if Biden, for example, were to win. Does this mean that there's sort of, a dissatisfaction, a lingering dissatisfaction with U.S. involvement in the region? Or is it, as Shai there said, that the U.S. should very much remain involved, but of course, in a way where it's ensuring that there will be positive outcomes also for the people who are right now very much dissatisfied with its policies in this region? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.